Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, the third in our ongoing series of conversations about the future of books and reading with publishing consultant Richard Eoin Nash, who ran the acclaimed Soft Skull Press between 2001 and March of this year. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. We continue our series of conversations on the future of books and reading today with Richard Eoin Nash, who ran the well-respected press Soft Skull from 2001 to March of this year. He's now struck out independently into the publishing world for himself. Richard, welcome to the program.
Hi, great to be here.
You've mentioned in other interviews that you fell into running Soft Skull. What was that actual procedure of falling that you did?
I was a theater director and a playwright I worked with a great deal. A guy named Sander Hicks had a press called Soft Skull, and I was sort of helping him out on the side with it. By coincidence, I'd had a temp job turn into a regular job for the sake of health insurance at Oxford University Press. I was doing it with no vocational interest whatsoever. It was just a way of getting the health insurance. But so I was able to be a little bit useful to my playwright friend Sander, and then basically a whole bunch of various different things blew up with the press and business and Sander himself, and so he took an indefinite leave of absence, and there were just a couple of kids there to run things. And you know, I was 30 and they were 22, and they thought, you know, it would be useful if you could help out with things like telling the printers that we will eventually pay them. And lots of not particularly sexy stuff. And I thought, okay, yeah, I'll do this for a few months out of the, you know, as some sense of messiah complex, and fell in love with it and discovered that this was a hell of a lot more fun than directing plays.
It was the office grown-up role you fell into then first.
Exactly. Exactly.
The process of falling in love with publishing, what did it take to make you fall in love? How much resistance was there?
Well, there was none, really.
Oh.
I'm predisposed to take on quixotic challenges. So the real impediment is, how could I find a way to afford to do this? And I had this other day job for a little bit that I managed to get myself laid off from, so that gave me unemployment, and I knew how to sort of do the beans and rice thing. So the falling in love was the easy bit. It was the surviving while in love that was always the challenge. And I suppose to unpack a little bit of how the falling in love was easy, it was that I had a sense that I never had when I was directing plays, that in some way I was able to speak to this larger group of people who I might never lay eyes on, were in some way part of a conversation that I was a part of. And that was just absolutely thrilling to a guy who was used to 25 people showing up each night for a play that might run for 4 or 8 performances. All of a sudden, people I would never lay eyes on were reading these books that I was making available. And you just realized you were part of a larger cultural and political dialogue. And that was really, you know, delirious.
It's funny that a number of people on this show who are guests will turn out to be, when I ask them, former playwrights. And I do tend to inquire as to, well, how could you leave being a playwright if that's what you liked in the first place? And they inevitably do say something like, well, in the career I moved to, people would actually hear what I was saying. So you fall into line with that.
Yeah, I mean, at times I feel like theater needs to go into some kind of cultural deep freeze for a century, because as a form, there's tremendous things that it can do, but somehow or another, it's not working with our society right now. So just, go into suspended animation and resurface 100 years from now, and people will probably be very interested in something happening.
That thought on theater, it fits in, it seems to me, with the other sorts of things you talk about under the broader heading of how to get cultural products to connect with cultural consumers. I mean, I guess theater is a good example for you of something that is currently failing to make that connection.
Yeah, especially in the United States.
What do you think is, I mean, not to take this conversation in a theatrical direction, but what does that teach you about what not to do when you're trying to hook up culture with the people who might enjoy it?
You have to avoid the alt, the OUGHE, the approach to culture that it should be consumed because it is good for you. In order for culture to function, it has to lock into receptors in humans in a way that is not forced, pull rather than a push.
The creators need to be out of the mindset then that what they're doing is, well, I mean, this is something that I hear occasionally, even in people in the publishing industry who will say, but what we're making is something that people need to hear, therefore they will?
Correct. That's just going to be a disaster. From a standpoint of trying to connect to people. We can't manipulate people into listening to us. We have to listen to them. And here's the critical thing. I'm not saying supply people with exactly what they already know they want. We can supply people with what they don't yet know they want. We have to do it through intensive, careful listening to their activities, to culture, the culture that is already there, and be incredibly as sensitively attuned to what people are responding to as possible, so that the things that we ourselves are interested as individuals, as cultural producers, like writers, or as cultural packagers, like publishers, so that we can frame, first select, and then frame the material that we're interested in, and then find a way to converse about it that allow consumers to feel, yeah, this is for me. I might not have necessarily known yesterday that this would be for me, but this is in fact something that I am finding myself connecting to.
Now, to go back a little bit to Soft Skull, what about the culture of Soft Skull was friendly to this sort of mindset that you're describing? Or I guess at the beginning, was it friendly to this mindset you're describing?
There were good days and bad days in terms of responding to that. I think I had my arrogant days and my humble days. With hindsight, the thing that was most critical, and I don't think I ever recognized this during the time, or I recognized it, but only in a kind of back of my head kind of way. We were open to the fact that our readers were also writers, that people wanted to participate in the community, not just passively, but actively participate. Not every reader wanted to write, but a lot of them wanted to write, to meet the authors, and a lot of them felt that their activity as a Soft Skull reader was a cultural statement. It was an act of self-expression. But I sort of begin from when I was asked just after I left Soft Skull, I sort of did a interview for a newspaper called the New York Observer that was writing a story about my replacement. And they asked me if I had any advice for my replacement. And one of the things I said was, go to all the parties. And another thing I said was, keep accepting unsolicited submissions, because those people are our readers. At the time, I was like, oh, that's what a boring statement to make. And then I realized, oh my God, no, that was actually the most important thing I could have said. That you have to be in a dialogue with your people. When I say your people, I mean your writers and your readers. Soft Skull at its best was doing that. At its worst, we were preaching. And at its worst, we were edgier than thou, defining ourselves through failure to connect. Oh, no one's reading our books. That makes us special.
It's kind of like you're not reading our books. That's fine. We wouldn't want you reading them anyway.
Precisely.
Oh.
That kind of attitude, I know, would occasionally slip in to me and my colleagues and the authors that we published, and that was us at our worst, because it's a kind of, I mean, it's understandable. It's a kind of self-protection mechanism. It's emotionally sometimes quite challenging to be a cultural entrepreneur or to be a culture maker. And there's a lot of rejection. And how do you deal with rejection? Well, sometimes you deal with the rejection by valorizing it. But in the end, that's a coping mechanism that's only going to take you so far. And you have to, instead of valorizing rejection, you have to find a way to be accepted. And that acceptance doesn't have to be unquestioning, ass-kissing acceptance. It can be respectful and challenging acceptance.
Some months back on this program, I was talking to Tom McCarthy, of course, for the Soft Skull release, Tintin and the Secret of Literature. We talked about another attitude that seems to me like it would be very poisonous, and it seems kind of widespread, is the notion that if something is cool, by definition, people won't buy it. And is that also kind of prevalent?
That's possible. That's possible. If it's cool, people won't buy it. I suppose it can go in kind of two different directions. One is that if we do something that people buy, that means it wasn't cool. Or if we focus on being cool, no one will buy. I mean, I think here's, I guess, a little bit of a gap between books and literary culture, let's say, long-form narrative culture, and music, movies, television. There, I think it's clear that cool music gets bought and cool movies get seen on a certain level. There's a certain kind of maybe sweet spot between the kind of eager, all-embracing mainstream and the tell-it-to-the-hands alternative. There's a sort of a spot in between where the audience, I don't know, they're in their tens of thousands maybe, enough that a book could be a huge success, enough that a band can get people to show up for a gig, enough that a art house screening of your movie is going to be well attended over a few weeks. Probably not the kind of audience that TV is looking for. I suspect when TV is cool, it's going to go out of when a TV show is cool, its audience is just never going to be what its advertisers are looking for. I'm thinking of shows I'm really fond of, like or network shows that I'm really fond of, like Friday Night Lights, that just never manage to find a normal level of a network audience. But I think I don't really know how to make something or how to identify and package something that is super mainstream. I don't have the instincts, but I sort of have an instinct for where something might reach the level of being cool. I think of that as being something, okay, well, that's going to make enough money for my company to function. And when I fail, it's because it wasn't cool enough.
So there's this specific spot you have to hit on the curve where you maximize the coolness, but not to the point where the coolness gets to be poisonous in a way. I don't know if that's exactly the way you would put it, but is that at least approaching it correct?
It's kind of the way I put it. It is. And the poison can be the poison of sucking up to everybody or the poison of ignoring everybody. But there's a spot in between. And that's where I try to find my spot.
Now, when I saw you recently on the Publishing 3.0 panel, they called it, at the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, it did strike me that you appeared to be, I don't want to say the only happy person on that panel, but the happiest person on that panel, at least judging by your words and demeanor. Why is that?
That's really cool. It's funny because I remember one of the questions that came from Twitter during the panel was, I guess we're all screwed if we're authors.
Yes.
I was totally perplexed by that because I felt optimistic, and I'm glad you felt my optimism there. My optimism inheres in the fact that I feel like we're in the process of identifying that thing about long-form narrative that is culturally sustainable for hundreds of years to come. And that is that books constitute that which people have in common with one another. By which I mean, if you look at any given dating website, matchmaking website, for a chunk of people out there in the world, the most reliable single thing that they could ask that leads them toward sensing that a person would be a suitable partner for them is their favorite book. It is just, a book is such a perfect, intimate statement about who you are. And it is also therefore a great way for two people to connect with one another, or five people to connect with one another over a book because of the richness and intimacy of the experience. It's probably, in some respects, it has what makes the podcast so fabulous, is a voice inside your head that you've permitted to come inside your head, except in the case of a book, it lasts for 15 or 20 hours. And the commonality shared by two people who've had that same voice inside their head for such an extended period of time is a rich commonality. And in our society, I think what people look for out of culture is a sense of shared experience. And so that, to my mind, gives books tremendous salience in our society, in a situation where books were often up against real challenges, like, well, the fact that they are so damn demanding. They do take so much time. You can't just, listen to a book for 3 minutes or 30 minutes or 60 minutes the way you can a song, a half-hour TV show, a CD of music, a 1-hour TV show. So that seems like it makes books almost impossible in this day and age to have any level of salience. But the very demands that books place upon people is in fact their source of appeal, not on a massive scale, but on an intense and ongoing scale. Books have huge opportunity. And when the price of content drops to zero, as it appears it's likely to do, books cost the same amount as everything else. But the price of culture, the price of connectivity, of communion is always going to be more than zero. And we see it right now in the ISP that we're using to communicate with one another, and that you're using to communicate with your listeners, for whom people are paying, $30, $40, $50 a month. People will pay for connectivity.
Indeed. I have to ask, since you've brought it up and since you've been inside publishing for a while, why are hardbacks still at $24.95, for example? What's keeping them there?
What I think is happening is that we've gotten locked into these price points of $15 to $25 because that's just how the entire industry is structured. Rather than deal with the writer-reader ecosystem as an ecosystem, books go from writer to agent to editor to sales force to the marketing and publicity people to the wholesaler to the retailer to the reader. And so the system is just sort of set up to operate that way, and $15 to $25 price points kind of like work in that universe. Not very well, but they sort of work. My sense is that the sort of one of the biggest hassles with that is that it has prevented two things from happening. One is that it has prevented publishing from charging more money from the people who are deep, profound fans of a given writer, and from charging far, far, far less money to those people who have absolutely no idea who that writer is, but friends has recommended it, and you think, okay, well, I'll try it. The real investment that people make in books is their time, not their money. So the money thing has to sort of shift to become a much more various thing where you can fly, first class for $3,500, or you can fly on those European flying buses for €8 in tax. A lot of industries have figured out different pricing schemes based on the intensity of the consumer's relationship to what they're selling. And the book world has a very, very narrow range of options. I think of the most extreme example right now in culture is probably Trent Reznor, who has 18 different price points, the CD plus his art plus his bloody thumbprint, $750, the CD plus a Polaroid of his, dog is, I don't even know exactly what Trent gives, but you know what I mean? That there's right. This people pay $250 at a benefit for dinner with Paul Auster. So Paul Auster's publisher should be charging, doing a version of the book that involves dinner with Paul. On the flip side, they should be giving in the United States. Auster doesn't sell nearly as well in the United States as he does in France. And so if they could find a way to increase the number of people sampling Paul Auster in the U.S., they would be in much better shape.
Would one way to execute this be then to have the bare bones ebook at the cheapest price point, and then you keep going up to the super hardcover commemorative handmade dinner with the author edition with, 5 or 6 in between? Is that kind of the model you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
How much have we seen of that? I take it very little.
In books, very little, although, oddly enough, over the years, there's a lot of scattered examples here, there, and everywhere. A wonderful independent publisher from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, Black Sparrow Press, who did all the William Burroughs, John Fante, a lot of people in that area, some beats. They always did 3 simultaneous editions: paperback, hardcover, and limited edition hardcover. There's a lovely poetry press up in Oregon called Wave Books, which has a sort of a membership program where you pay $300 a year, and I think they've got maybe 300 or 400 members, and you get 5 hardcover books signed and numbered by the author, with a letter written by the editor for each book explaining, why he or she published the book, and then they get invited to 2 or 3 cocktail parties a year. And then you have the whole sort of NPR model, public radio model of memberships. So there's bits and pieces. I guess the original, writers, they had patrons. They didn't really ever, there wasn't enough of a distribution system in the 18th century for writers to make money selling books. So instead they had a patron. I believe Samuel Johnson's dictionary was paid for by a patron.
To go back to that young lady who had tweeted at the Publishing 3.0 panel that it sounds like whatever happens, the writers are screwed. I do wonder, what have you seen reaction-wise as far as writers being willing to go along with all the extra stuff that is entailed in these various editions of their work, various price points of their work? Is there a sentiment that they want to be able to live their fantasy of just writing, doing nothing else, and waiting for the big royalties, or is there an eagerness to go along with all of this?
It varies, but there is still a fair amount of the former. There is still a strong predisposition amongst a lot of writers to think, I just write and my people will figure out the rest. And while I don't think that my people of the world, the other intermediaries, the concierges is a term that I'm finding myself using recently, aren't going to vanish necessarily, but that the writer has to work with the people who are assisting in this particular process. The writer can't just, press the on switch and all the little robots go do their activity. The writer also doesn't have to do it all him or herself. There's a few people out there who are predisposed to want to do it all themselves, and those people are obviously hugely excited about this particular way of engaging with culture and of making a living. But I feel that the future is going to end up being less scary than those writers who thought they could just sit in the garret and have lunch with their editor once a year and leave it at that. Because it turns out that as writers participate in it, they find out they're having fun than they expected. I'm friendly with a former freelance publicist who's now more of a kind of a buzz-making guru, Lauren Sarand. And the thing that Lauren does with her clients is she doesn't try to make them blog. What she starts by doing is she tells them 10 blogs to read. And she just lets them read the stuff. And they get intrigued by it, and they start reading on a regular basis, and then they find themselves commenting. And after a while, they're realizing, well, if I'm going to spend all my time commenting on these things, why don't I comment on my own blog? It's you can lead a horse to water. The real, I think, usefulness of that metaphor is that you can lead a horse to water and eventually the horse will drink. That this world that seems to be so scary is in fact this tremendously rich world of connecting with fellow culture makers and readers. It's really not as bad as people think, but I think they need to kind of it's a process. I think it's going to be a process for a lot of writers to get to where they're having fun doing the ancillary stuff around the writing, that the ancillary stuff is no less culturally meaningful than the writing itself. I've seen that with my friend who's a novelist, Colson Whitehead, who's become one of the best Twitterers, knocking out these little dry, sardonic, slightly Dadaist spots on Twitter, and it's part of his form of cultural expression now. It also happens to be raising his profile and helping sell his book, but it's also him making culture.
If you've just tuned in, this is The Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. You can find our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com, plus a whole lot more good stuff. My guest is Richard Eoin Nash, publishing consultant and the man who ran the acclaimed Soft Skull Press between 2001 and March of this year. Now, I think from what I've seen, and tell me if this is something you have seen borne out as well, but the writers who are the very youngest generation of writers, I'm thinking ones born in the 1980s, they kind of already know this, but they may not know they know it. They know it so well that they were doing all the social networking in advance, in many cases, of the actual writing.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's right. I'm looking at it from a perspective of a guy who didn't have email in college, and so I graduated in 1993. Basically, they had just installed Ethernet into the dorm rooms, and most everyone was confused and thought they were the wrong size telephone jacks. Email was something that was done by Korean math students.
Now, with the whole idea, the notion that you've talked about before of the gatekeeper model becoming more the concierge model, and how publishers may be less entities that decide what the public's going to see and become entities, or should become entities that connect readers or whoever, consumers of culture with creators of culture. Now, how minority is your view in the publishing world?
I don't know. I guess I'm going to find out over the next couple of weeks, because I'm doing 2 presentations and I will probably get a sense as to how bizarre / welcome my thoughts are going to be. I'm in the process of, to be perfectly candid, developing a business plan for a company that would basically be this kind of new model publishing business, which wouldn't even, it would be doing publishing in the conventional sense of the term, but it would also be designed to be a community of writers and readers with a much more flattened hierarchy in terms of, I'm not saying that it would be a place where no distinction whatsoever gets made between the authors whose work we are going to make available in print and make available as digital download, as well as up in the website, and those writers whose work is just there up on the website. And I put just kind of in quotation marks, because I don't necessarily assume that is, I don't wish to sort of downplay that as a form of publishing. I don't know how people are going to react. I sort of feel like when I talk about it, and this may be me that I haven't developed a proper elevator pitch for it yet, but that when I sort of talk about these things here and there, it appears that, there's a variety of missed connections that happen. Are you abandoning the print book? No. Are you going to be just a company that's doing self-publishing? No. One of the biggest challenges in reorganizing the book world to reflect the hybrid of professional and user-generated content that is going on in other media is one of almost terminology. The word book means long-form narrative, but it also means physical object. Publishing assumes a process of does it mean the selection process? Does it mean the printing process? Does it mean the publicity and marketing process? It's our terms are all kind of very up for grabs right now. So, there's I suppose some level of resistance out there, but how much of it is a problem of terminology, and how much of it is my own failure to communicate, and how much of it is just the raw resistance itself, I don't know yet. That's a sort of a process that's kind of beginning, and that I'm going to have to sort of learn to navigate my way through, in part by being a better explainer, and in part perhaps just by persuading enough people that I can raise the money to be able to start doing it, and through the process of doing it, that will then become the best explanation of all.
Just a proof of concept there in the actual action.
Precisely.
It seems to me there may be an element here of the object, being a victim of its own success. I mean, humanity has thought of books as books, almost back to the Gutenberg Bible. I mean, it seems as if books have gotten so good and humanity has gotten so used to them over the years that any attempt to change the mindset is going to be a huge uphill battle for that alone.
That is absolutely dead on. One of the perversities is that so many of the terms that we use to describe computers are words taken from books. The best way to describe to people who hadn't dealt with computers before how something worked, scrolling, browsing, web page. Yes, thank you. Most media developed its mass-produced form over 100 to 150 years. Photography, film, the phonograph. Books alone amongst all these forms developed their mass-produced form 600 years ago. So they've become so refined. The technology has been so well refined over 600 years. It's so durable, resilient, and embedded a technology that making that adjustment is tremendously challenging. And it is going to mean that from a business standpoint, the transformation, the sort of digital transformation, is going to need to coexist for much, much longer with the old technology. In fact, the old technology in some sense will probably never, or at least not for hundreds of years, be completely supplanted by the new technology. Much as, even in music, vinyl still has a very important, niche role. So there's going to be a remarkable level of persistence of old technology alongside the new, but that's going to create all kinds of model complexities and all kinds of hybridities as this transition occurs. The disruption that gets talked about with technology, the print technology is too robust to be obliterated in the disruption, in the way that the CD functionally has been obliterated.
And of course, the CD has only been around since 1982, so no one really has that deep an attachment.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
It's like I think of that complaint that people often bring up somewhat nonsensically whenever I'm talking about ebooks or reading a book on the internet or what have you, and they'll say, well, you can't take that to the bathtub. And these are people who never take a book to the bathtub anyway. I mean, who...
Exactly.
Who does that anymore? Yeah, I'd be surprised if they had a tub, let alone read a book there ever. And yet, that's their complaint, that they can't do that. What do you think that springs from? Is it the same thing we just talked about?
I think it's that it's a way for them to state a certain truth. That truth being book technology is incredibly useful and effective. Here, it's a nice kind of simple way of stating how durable book print technology is, but it is useless as a kind of a practical statement for why electronic technology isn't useful. Simply stating why print is useful doesn't undermine the argument as to why electronic is useful in other ways. You can't jump over a fence with a car. But it doesn't mean that cars aren't a lot better for driving around cities
It's true.
than
It's
horses. True. People still jump over fences with horses and always will. And a few people will take a book to the bathtub, or more likely, people will continue to buy books for emotional reasons. Medium term for practical reasons, but as battery life and Wi-Fi extend, we're pretty much never going to be in a situation where we're kind of so far out of range and so far out of electricity that we need analog to read. But there'll still be, we can be in a warm enough environment that we don't need a t-shirt and still want to have this really cool t-shirt. So people will buy physical books for their physicalness.
I always respond to the bathtub complaint that I've come to call it, just saying, look, give humanity 10 years, we'll have an ebook reader that is flexible, looks like paper, that is color, that is actually submersible. So, just give it some time and you'll be able to take that into the bath if you really want.
That is in fact also true. You're absolutely right.
And now one thing I always think about is there's a lot of talk. I mean, when people talk about the future of publishing, they're almost invariably just in common conversations, not industry, talking about ebooks, talking about various electronic ways to read books. They never really talk about print on demand, and I always think that is more of a shining beacon than it really seems to be. What are your thoughts on print on demand?
As a effective short to medium term process, it has tremendous application. And it's actually kind of being used more than you might think in the background. A lot of university presses are doing almost exclusively print on demand, in part because university presses frequently, some of the books they publish are sold in bookstores, but a lot of books they publish aren't really sold in bookstores. They're sold through a website, direct mail to libraries. The biggest hassle with print on demand, basically, is that as it's currently implemented, bookstores will only order a print on demand book if they have a concrete order for it. Publishers really prefer for them to order probably like 5 or 8 copies so that they be face out rather than spine out and be toward the front of the store. So what you have is a kind of we're going through kind of a transitional period where print on demand is being used either if the book's not really going to be sold in a bookstore, as in the case of University Press, or if the book is kind of in its second or third or fourth year of life and it has already established itself in the marketplace through 5 or 8 or 3 or 300,000 copies having been distributed to bookstores and stacked up or placed face out, so that the effectiveness of merchandising that the book is in effect a sort of a 6-inch by 9-inch ad telling people it exists and promoting its desirability. That work has been sort of done, and the word of mouth has happened. So now it's a process of a person has already decided they want that book and they're going to go into a bookstore and get it, and it's spine out and there's only one copy, and when that copy is bought, then they'll order another copy, and that copy can come in on a print-on-demand basis. So would it be desirable, or would it be sort of interesting to sort of shift merchandising models a little bit and have a bookstore order just one copy, but have it be on a little podium, a little stand face out, and people say, I want that, and then a copy is printed up? That would be a way of allowing for the point of purchase visibility of the book to still happen without having to order 8 copies on spec. Print on demand isn't really being used for that yet, and it's really, I think, up to, readers to and make that adjustment, although obviously with the help of the publisher.
My own personal, probably delusional fantasy has always been of a futuristic kind of vending machine that I can go up to and just have any book civilization has ever made printed right then and there in like 5 seconds. But I don't know if the technology is there.
It's closer. 5 seconds, it's not there, but 2 to 5 minutes is there. The question is, one of the things that those can do is not just achieve what you just described, but also, if it's, let's say, in practice in a local bookstore, that local bookstore would, in my opinion, do well to only have that entire library of books available that could be printed out, but also be functioning as a micro-publishing service for locals, a history of the local hardware store, the genealogy of the family that ran the mill, a guide to the flora and fauna of the local forest, the novel or poetry book by the local literati, as well as what you describe, a kind of the entire sort of library of Alexandria. And so it would also help sort of drive use of the machine. There's a company, Espresso, like the coffee, that has a machine, a print-on-demand machine. I don't know how much it's costing. I don't know what their business model is. Maybe they lease it to bookstores, but some bookstores have picked up, and at North Shire Bookstore in Manchester Centre, Vermont, or are they New Hampshire? They're like right on the border of Vermont and New Hampshire. Manchester Centre, the bookstore is definitely called North Shire, and they've installed one of those machines in the basement. Now, I think there's I believe they recently did a deal with Ingram. Ingram is the largest wholesaler in the United States, and they are the biggest. Within their warehouses, they have print-on-demand machines, and they're one of the biggest purveyor of print-on-demand services in the United States. And I believe they have done a deal with Espresso whereby they're making their catalog available for sale through Espresso. I think Espresso's biggest problem is they didn't have a whole lot of content, which is insane because there's absolutely no reason for a publisher not to do a deal in that kind of situation. There's enough money to go around to feed everyone's mouth in a print-on-demand $15 paperback when it's coming out of a machine like that. You're not going to get artisanal quality out of that, but you are going to get a level of quality that really is basically the same as any trade paperback in the United States right now, or as good as 98% of them. There's some people who are doing quite exquisitely packaged paperbacks, with French flaps and ragged edge and, rich paper. But for the most part, regular offset printing quality is now matched by digital printing. And so anyone who does want the physical book but wants it in, as you sort of describe, in a situation where you can just go to the device and buy it and know that there isn't a huge amount of waste going on of lots of books being printed on spec and then, returned to a warehouse and pulped. It's less of a fantasy than you might worry.
Now, there's one more thing I want to ask you about. It's a quote, actually, from one of the other interviews you've done, I believe, that encapsulates a lot of the themes I want to make sure to drive home here. You say that people with the talent to persuasively communicate the merits of cultural content are going to do immensely well in the future. Now, who are those people? Who might we identify as people who can do that right now?
Oprah is probably the most successful of them all. There's you, Colin,
all right.
yourself.
That's funny. It's good you say that, because that's actually, I was reading that quote and I thought to myself, that's actually, I kind of feel a kinship with that mission, because really this show boils down to, as a message to the listener, hey, check this out. Whatever the guest is, check this out. It's really nothing more than that at its very core.
In a certain sense, when I was sort of struggling to describe the business model of new hybrid publishing, it's because the simple answer is the one that you just gave. But it is so simple, folks get confused by it. In a sense, that's all it comes down to in the end, is trusted recommendations.
It comes to what you call it's another element of the social glue of culture. You have to, if there's a bond there, there's going to be, the recommendations over it are going to be taken seriously.
Precisely.
Well, Richard Nash, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program.
It's a privilege to have a chance to talk to you and your folks.
To find out more about Richard Eoin Nash and his current publishing efforts, visit rnash.com. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. Our music, as always, is produced by Ben Althouse. Check out his work at benalthouse.com and check out our complete show archive at colinmarshallradio.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.